Let us begin a little with the great cosmic covenant. I had a revelation, I guess you would say, at Brenda Westbel's house as we were talking in regards to what it was that we should probably, speaking of me particularly, but some of us that are aware of this, we should be doing, what should we be talking about, what should we be getting advice about, and that is, in the book of Enoch, there is a great cosmic vow or covenant. I've done other sessions on this that are, they go into depth with the book of First Enoch or Ethiopic Enoch. And I want to get off to the side a little bit this time because we want to investigate this cosmic covenant that is between Elohim and all creation as to what it entails, and finally, what we can do to be a part of fulfilling this covenant. Now, we've got the Torah, we're trying to do that. But this covenant came before the Torah, and it's been entirely neglected today. It's not named among the covenants of Judaism or anything else. And it's disdained really by the factions of Judaism that are in vogue today. Rabbinical Judaism not only will have nothing to do with this, but they'll have nothing to do with the books that contain it, like Jubilees, like First Enoch, like Third Baruch, like even Romans, or tonight we're going to look at Hebrews a little bit. But we have to start with a little background, historical background of that time, the time when we pick up knowledge about this covenant that is to be fulfilled in the end time, not only with human beings, that's fulfilled through salvation, but for all creation, everything ever created in the entire universe. The Hebrew for that is Haolam, or Haolam Vaed, which is usually interpreted as forever, but it entails all things, Olam, having to do with the wholeness of everything. Okay, just need to get the sportscast off. So as we start with the history, we're going to go to the Second Temple period, which was a period of 655 years all told, as far as I can see, beginning with the Babylonian exile in 586 BC. Now, the Babylonians held the Judeans, or the Yahud, for 47 years. 586 to 539. Then you might remember the Persians took over from 539 to 333. And, we'll go into it a little more later. Hellenistic periods, 333 to 164. So in the Babylonian, we've got 47 years. In the Persian, we've got 206 years. In the Hellenistic, which is the next period, 169 years. The Ptolemaic, which is an Egyptian dynasty, 101 years. The Seleucid, from 200 to 164 BC, 36 years. The Hasmonean or the Maccabean, 164 to 63, 101 years. And the final period was the Roman period from 63 BC, when Pompey came in, to 70 of Anno Domini, Anno Domino, that is the year of our Lord, 70 CE, 70 AD, 655 all told. The Second Temple period begins with the ending of the first. The capture of Jerusalem by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar, or Nebuchadrezzar. Solomon's temple at that time was destroyed. The elite of Judea were deported to Babylon. In 536, the Babylonian Empire fell to the Persian king Cyrus, or Koresh, or Cyrus, whatever Bible you happen to have. And you might remember that there's a prophecy about Cyrus that said he was my anointed, my Messiah. So in the year 538 BC, 1 year after Cyrus came into power over Babylon, the exiles were permitted to return. After that time, the temple is commonly said to have been rebuilt between 520 and 515 BC. That's just a very short time, 18 years after the exiles were permitted to return home. This may be an artificial date, though, 520 to 515, because Jeremiah's 70-year prophecy could be seen to have been fulfilled, being in captivity in Babylon for 70 years. The Hellenistic period started with Alexander the Great, his conquest in about 333 BC. Remember, Alexander the Great set out to conquer the world and was so extremely disappointed when he did, and there was nothing else to conquer. And some say he died by choking on a piece of pork at the age of 31. It may have been that this was a Jewish myth concerning Alexander, but by and large, the Yahud community did quite well under Alexander's tutelage and his conquest. When he died, Judea became the possession of the Ptolemies. Those were descendants in Egypt of one of the generals of Alexander that had given over the Palestine area to the Ptolemies. One of his generals was Ptolemy. And there was a great dynasty that came after that, which you can read primarily about in the Maccabees, especially Third Maccabees. If you remember the story of the 500 crazed and drunken elephants and the Judeans all packed into a hippodrome, a place where elephants put on shows, that you might remember the elephant keeper, whose name was Herman, was told by Ptolemy to give these elephants frankincense and wine mixed together and make them crazy so that they could go in and stomp out all the Jews in Egypt that were put in the hippodrome. What a story that is. Read it in Third Maccabees. In 200 BC, Israel was captured by an army from another of Alexander's generals, and they were called the Seleucids, because the first general there, his name was Seleucia. So we've got the Seleucid Empire on the other side in Syria. Again, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids were both Greek in origin and did their best to bring Greek culture into those areas as they were taught by their commander. And the Greek culture was continued down through the generations of both the Seleucids and the Ptolemies in those areas. About 167 then, Antiochus IV, Epiphanes. You remember him from Daniel, the little horn in Daniel, and in the Maccabees as well, one of the Seleucid kings. He came in to Judea and suppressed worship altogether, took the gold from the temple, took over the entire land, and he replaced Jewish practices with Greek pagan practices. And this is where we get Hellenist Jews spoken of in the New Testament. They were only Jews in the sense of their bloodlines. They were not worshiping Jews, but by and large, they spoke Greek and they worshiped Greek gods. We even have in Jesus' disciples, we have some Hellenists, we believe, Philippos, a Greek name, as well as Andrew and Peter are Greek names. Perhaps they were Hellenists as well. We grew up in a land where Hebrew was no longer spoken. Aramaic was simply a native tongue of the people in villages, but by and large, the people spoke Greek, even in Palestine. So Antiochus' fourth Epiphany suppressed all worship, and this provoked a revolt from the Hasmoneans, that is the Maccabees, and you know the story about that. One man stands up against the Greek viceroy, and all of a sudden, a revolution brews, headed by one family, a family of a father and 5 brothers. And Judas Maccabee is the most well-known, a very devout person, and very able to be a general of not an organized army, but rather insurrectionists that beat off the professional armies of the Greeks over a period of time. Unfortunately, each one of the Maccabean brothers were killed in battle until we get down to the last one, Jason. And he went back to Greek culture and colluded again with the Greeks and brought the Greeks back in. There's a sad story about that that is out of our line of cosmic covenant here, so we won't go into that. But suffice it to say, that particular family has a history that was and is extremely interesting to read about. And I think my favorite book on that subject is Second Maccabees. It's not so cut and dried as First. Try it sometime. That's in the apocryphal section, the middle section between testaments, those days when God was silent for 400 years. The next period was the Roman period. The Maccabees become clients of Rome after they had gone back over to the Greeks. In order to save them from the Greeks, they called the Romans in. And they actually called in the general, Pompey. They came from Rome and brought huge armies in, and they routed the Greeks, and then they routed the Judeans and took over the land there in about 60 AD. So the Romans then became the rulers of that area and set up client kings there, like, for instance, the Herods. Herod, of course, was not Jewish. He'd become a Jewish convert, at least his family had, through the conquest of the Israelites during the Maccabean periods. And Herod was a client of Rome. Though he was from Idumea or Arabia, he had been brought up to Rome to be trained and to live in the palace with the other royals. And Herod was then given the rulership of all of Israel. He became Herod the Great primarily for his building. He built and built and built all kinds of monuments there, and cities even, and of course the 5 different fortresses there. I'll give you 13 golden emerods if you can name all 5 fortresses. And then his kin ruled until 70 AD, through the end of the Roman period, when in 70 AD, the revolt was to its fruition and Jerusalem was destroyed. In that particular 7-year period between 66 AD and 73 AD, 7 years of the revelation that we have in our New Testaments. This is important in that Revelation, as I've said many times, is not a prophetic work. It's an apocalyptic work, and there's quite a bit of difference. So we go into Enoch a little later, we'll find that Enoch 2 is an apocalypse. It is a coded message about what's happening at the time. And usually in apocalyptic literature, you can tell that it's that type because there's an angel guide or some kind of guide, and there's a vision or a dream that the protagonist is being led around to different places in the dream and explained by an angel or whatever as to what's going on. In an apocalypse, no matter how terrible things are, there's always a happy ending. Always the kingdom comes. Always the righteous are exalted and sinners are either tortured or destroyed. These are a couple of the characteristics of apocalyptic literature, and you can see that in Daniel and Revelation. Also in Enoch. Brother Shroomkopf calls the endings of such texts the apocalyptic lie. I'm not so sure I agree with him. The idea of apocalypse in the first place is to tell the present in coded language, but then give hope for the future by then having a messianic figure come or God himself come down in some form and destroy all the evil on the earth. Yet we do understand and believe that as it's going to become our own future when evil is judged and equitable justice finally reigns. I'm looking at messages as we're doing this. By the way, I'm in Holland, Michigan right now. Commander Lee's around here someplace. It just so happens we were going through Michigan meeting people that are interested in Jihad on our trip here. We're 4 weeks into it right now. And I found out there was a family reunion up here in Michigan of my family. I didn't even know about it. But we happened to be in Michigan, and they happened to be in Michigan. So we're all happy together here in Holland, Michigan, with something of a family reunion here where we were able to pick up our swords from years ago and fight it out again and then become friends over and over again. So I've got my 2 brothers upstairs, lots of nieces and nephews, and my mother's even here, and then some friends of the family. And well, there's good things and bad things about that, as I imagine you can tell. But one thing that's good is that we've got a warm place to stay at this time. We had an appointment that had to be postponed and we had nowhere to go. And so this just came up. And I'm just wondering if it's a coincidence or not. Of course it's not. Of course not. In the diaspora or the dispersion, the exiles of Judea who were in Babylon, they got along very well indeed. When Cyrus permitted them to return, that is, the conquering Persian King Cyrus, the vast majority of the Jews did not. They wanted to stay. They couldn't remember what it was like to be in the Holy Land before, because very few were still alive. They and their descendants formed the diaspora, a large community of Jews. They're living outside of Israel or Judea. Josephus reports that more Jews lived in the Seleucid Empire, that is the Syrian Greek Empire, than any place else. To the east of Israel, there was also significant Jews in Egypt living under the Ptolemies, being, and I quote, attracted by Hellenistic culture. Consider Hellenistic, of course, that means Greek culture with Greek gods, Greek customs, quite unlike the staid and stern ways of the Jews with their Torah. The Greeks were extremely liberal and democratic in many ways, and many of the Jews gave up on the Torah or any kind of restrictions of their life to become Hellenist or Greek and to live the life of the Greeks, which was far and away different from that of the religious Jews. They wanted to win respect of the Greeks. They wanted to adopt to their ways. And you might remember that circumcision was outlawed, that the Greeks brought in with them the gymnasium, where you would go in like an exercise club here, only you went in naked, both men and women, which was considered in the Jewish customs as a shameful act to be seen naked, but it was even more shameful to look upon the naked. But the Greeks brought this in and became very popular, as well as public baths and many other customs, like, again, eating pork, eating unclean animals, that was abominable to the Jews that were religious, but to those that adopted that culture, remembering they were 300 years in that culture, really, I think that probably we would adopt something too. Look at how we're eating Chinese food, though every time we eat it, we go into a temple of paganism. Just look at the walls sometime. We have adopted a custom that we weren't accustomed to before, say, 30 years ago. The Egyptian diaspora came to outstrip the Babylonian. The Western became greater than the Eastern. There were Jewish communities throughout the Hellenistic and the Roman world, from North Africa to Asia Minor to Greece and in Rome itself. We can't center all Jewish work in Palestine, as we are biblically oriented, and we are wont to do through literature. It's not necessarily historic, especially when we consider that in Galilee proper, the main language that was spoken was not Aramaic, but Greek. In the Second Temple period, Samaria, the Middle Kingdom, was larger, it was richer, more populous than Judea, the southern kingdom. In the time of the Maccabees, there were more Samaritans than there were Judeans in Palestine. Samaritans, which were a mixed culture of Jews and Persians or Easterners, Samaritans had on their own temple on the Mount Gerizim, near that place that we read about in the Old Testament called Shechem or Bethel. They regarded themselves to have the only true Torah, and also to be the only true Israel. In fact, if you take a look at the beliefs of the Samaritans in the Second Temple period, you'll find they're very similar to the beliefs we who call ourselves Essenes or Ebionites or Hasidim have today. Samaritans are the closest. The remnants left behind when Israel was deceived by this wicked priest, Eli or Eli, to leave Gerizim and worship in Jerusalem. This caused a terrible schism between the Samaritans and the Judeans. And it came to the point where Samaritans no longer considered themselves as a part of greater Judaism, but rather as the chosen ones, the true Israel, the true vine. We see some of that when we have Yeshua in the New Testament coming into Samaria at the well and talking to the woman at the well. And what he says indicates that the worship of Gerizim was very common even in the days after the temple was destroyed there. He says the day will come when you'll neither worship on that mountain, probably pointing to Gerizim, or in Jerusalem. Who's this right here?
But to those who would worship him in spirit and in
Okay,
truth.
here's Pete Snyder.
And that wasn't not in Jerusalem, by the way. That was Jacob's well in the land of the Samaritans. I'm Jack's brother. I'm glad to see you today.
He's the one that talks a lot. Let's see. Let's get him on.
This is wonderful that I can have my first time to be with you today.
I said, come down here and refute me.
They say when you do selfies, put your head up like that, and then they won't see your double chin.
That's right.
How am I doing?
You're doing good, but you gained a lot of weight.
Do I look like my brother, though?
Who do you
What
think?
difference is
Marcel says, hi, Pete.
Is that
You look
Phil?
like your mom.
Oh,
Is that
that's
Phil?
what everybody- You look just like your mother.
It's Phil up there?
Hey, Jackson, is that Phil?
No,
That's
it's
Pete.
I'm Pete.
Hey.
I'm the missionary to China.
Oh, bless you.
Bless your heart. It's nice talking to you. I'm happy to be with my brother Jack up here in Holland, Michigan right now.
He says he's Paul and I'm James.
Yeah, that's the,
That's how we get along.
you know, 2,000 years later, it's the same old, same old. And there's nothing wrong with that because in heaven, they're reconciled. Look at Luther.
Amen.
in the New Jerusalem anyway.
Well, that
Is Phil there?
Hey, and look at we got Philip.
What?
here.
Wait,
What's wrong with you
Oh
people
my
there?
gosh.
Yay!
We got that's
the
Jack.
Three
Let's all
Musketeers.
get on
No,
here.
it's Larry
Let's
Moon
all
and
get on
Curly.
here. Here's my hand.
We got everybody here. Get over here where we can get.
Hey, Jack, is Phil there?
Yeah.
We're
Don't
all-
you see me right here? That's Phil.
We're
Phil,
all
how
here.
you doing, brother?
I'm doing good, brother. How you doing?
Oh, man, you look good, man. You look good. Hallelujah.
What
I
are we
feel
talking
pretty good.
to
I
then?
just had a nap.
That's Bishop Riesch.
We were
Yeah.
wondering the bishop.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh! I
I know you're going to be in trouble. I'll show you where he is. Oh, he doesn't have his picture up. He just has a picture on there.
He remembers me.
You know, this is being recorded. Get mom down here in this picture.
Well, she's up there, but it's hard for her to get up and down the steps. We're just happy to spend a few minutes with you because you know this is one point in all of eternity that might last forever.
Yeah, let's do the candle thing.
How are they?
Yeah, the candle love.
Get
We
in
light
here
the
so we
light
can
of
see it.
love. Wohelo means love.
Wohelo, that's like a
Candle.
Girl Scout.
No, that's an Indian
Okay, we
term.
got it.
Okay.
Well,
See you later.
Just kick
Yeah.
Mother down the steps.
Taste the bananas.
Bill, can you be available tomorrow after 2 o'clock or something like that?
That was a nice little.
That was fun.
He looks different. He sounds different.
Who's that?
Like a travel-
Phil.
That's because he isn't so crazy as he was.
Hallelujah.
Listening to talk
That's
about
not bad.
his vision and everything.
You sound like what some of those color folk at the AA Allen meeting.
Hey, you can't call them colored folks anymore.
I can.
That's politically
Okay.
Commander Lee's here too.
Okay. All right.
I don't know who he's talking to over there. Commander Lee just went and had a piece of ice cream cake. Well, back to the boring part. Judeans regarded these Samaritans as foreign converts because they had originally come from a foreign area. In fact, it is said that the Pharisees themselves came from the same area as the Persians did. We were talking.
Adjust your camera, brother.
Oh, yeah? Why? Oh, well, that's what I want you to see. Cool to see the legendary
Your
brother.
brains.
I don't have any. Now, where was I? Heck, this isn't important anyway. Nobody cares about it. Let's talk about literature. Much of what we have of the Bible was assembled in the 5th century BC. It reflects the reality of the Persian period. And you can tell by reading the prophets that Persians are spoken of like Kyrus or Cyrus. The returnees, they had an interest in Israeli history. Now, the written Torah may have existed in several different forms during the monarchy, that is, the entire reign of the Davidic kings. But it was in the Second Temple period that it was revived into something like its current form. At the Chronicles, a new history was written. That was the last book that was written in the Old Testament, so we say, a new history that actually redacted and changed some of the history of the kings. I kind of think of Kings as being the history of the kings of Judea, and Chronicles being the history of the kings of Israel, written much later again. And this reflects in the Chronicles the concerns of the Persian Jews, or the Pharisees, in its exclusive focus on Judah and the temple. Remember, 200 to 100 BC, the Pharisees took over the temple and were considered at that time to be in foreign power. And the Queen Alexandra in the 1st century BC exiled the priests and brought the Pharisees in to even run the temple. So we have a real turnover in the 1st century BC, as well as all these occupations that religious Jews had to go through. The reason I even go through this is to see the kind of turmoil that this country was in over and over and over again over the course of the selfsame Second Temple period. Prophetic works were being composed, like the last chapter of Isaiah's and the book of Haggai, the book of Zechariah, and the book of Malachi. Maybe even Joel was in this later period. The older prophets were edited and they were reinterpreted and rewritten for us. The corpus of wisdom books, they welcome Job, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes. Sometimes they say that Job is the oldest book in the New Testament. Some scholars say so. I'm with that. Others say it's one of the newer books. I can't figure, because in the book of Job, we have a council of gods, or Elohim, and one of that council is the devil. You know, in the book of Job, we've got the first 2 chapters and the last chapters that are original, and the story in between of Job's friends is an addition from later times as well. We also have the extra chapters of the book of Daniel. Don't know if you ever read those. They were written in Greek. Daniel and Susanna, Daniel, Bel and the Dragon. The story of Judith was written in that particular time. There's one more, the Daniel and the 3 children of Israel, written at that time in Greek. They're not going to be found in your Protestant Bible, but they're still in the Roman Catholic Bible. And you can read them there, or you can go to my site there, jspresents.org, and I've already read them for you. You can listen to them. Also, the books of Tobit and Esther, I have those too. These Eastern Jews were responsible for the transmission of Babylonian and Persian apocalyptic traditions as seen in Daniel. So we're seeing in these apocalypses, like Daniel and Revelation and 3rd Baruch and Zechariah and some more, a strong foreign influence, especially from Persia. And we remember that after the Persian domination was the Greek domination. And during the Greek period, a lot of our literature came to be, the apocalyptic literature that we read right now, and consider oft times for the future, because we don't know that it hasn't already come to pass. But in the case of Daniel, in the case of Revelation, and in the case of Zechariah, such has come to pass. But remember, in every apocalypse, there is, he's not here right now, but Shrumi says the apocalyptic lie at the end, where everything turns out all right again, so the people that read them will have hope for the near future. You know, it could happen any day. I've heard this since I was a teenager. Jesus could come today. And is your heart right? Is Jesus living in your heart? If you died tonight, would you go to heaven or hell? What would you do? Get up here to the altar. This is apocalypse at work. As it said, literature is stronger than history. History is dry, usually dead, unless you are interested in knowing the truth of the victors. But literature can say anything you want, and it can mimic history to the point where the use of literature can persuade and bring you to a certain knowledge of history that is not history at all, but was written for another purpose. And a lot of these apocalypses were. It was about the times that they were in, that only the ones that were understanding the codes, the prophetic codes that were put into the apocalypse, and then they could understand that it's going to be all right. You're going to be fetched out. You're going to be raptured out. You're not going to have to stand the types of tortures and warfare that the others are, especially the sinners, because you're going to be called out. In Revelation, for instance, we've got the 144,000. 144,000 is an apocalyptic number. It's not a literal number, but you break it into parts and it means something very specific. People think, well, that is for this day and there's going to be a rapture and I'm in the 144,000. I got to be because I'm the Sunday school teacher, something like that. However, in Revelation, for instance, yes, the 144 are exalted in that they end up with Messiah on the top of Mount Zion, but they have to die first. The 144,000 have to die. All right, so we take that as a promise today. It's a good thing for our faith, but what is faith and what is sight? We need to learn. We need to learn. In worship, the Torah, the Hebrew Bible, the beliefs that are written in there are only a small part of the beliefs of the Israelite community. Those who insisted on the exclusive worship of Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. Those who collected, edited, and transmitted the biblical texts. Those who insisted on the exclusive worship of one God and saw their mission to return to Jerusalem so as to impose the same vision of genealogical purity upon those who were there, who had stumbled into all kinds of polytheism. The earliest stages of the Persian period, the returnees insisted on the strict separation between themselves, that is, Israel, and the Judeans, who had never gone into exile, whom they called Canaanites. The Judeans that stayed behind, that had never gone into the dispersion, were not known as Judeans anymore, but Canaanites, the Israelites that came back, took the moniker of Israelites then, and subjected these people to lesser social status and certainly religious status as well. Primarily because of the prohibition on intermarriage. In the meantime, those that were left behind in the dispersion, left behind? Yeah, those that are left behind in the dispersion married into whatever families they possibly could, including some of the priests that were left behind. This was presented to them in terms of religious purity. We read in the Torah the importance of purity, and especially in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Purity is extremely important, as we learned at boot camp this year from the fragments from the MMT, the Miksat HaMasah HaTorah. Purity was everything, all the time. When the Torah and the prophets were accepted by the first century, beyond the core of small Jewish groups, then through the efforts, especially of the Pharisees who had rewritten them and who were the popularist party, these books were considered authoritative, but not until the Pharisees had taken over. And you know, in 70 AD, the only real movement that existed out of traditional Judaism was the foreign movement, that is, the Pharisees. They were able to strike a deal with the Romans and therefore had a place to grow and continue to collude while they grew their own religion based on their own texts. Wouldn't it be something if we could learn for sure that these Dead Sea Scrolls were part of the original temple texts as we believe? The priesthood then went through profound changes in that Second Temple period. In the First Temple period, the priests were subordinate to the kings. But in the Second Temple period, with the monarchy no longer available, and they didn't have a state to themselves, the priesthood become independent. They become rulers. And honestly, a priesthood under a high priest and a nation under a high priest would develop a kind of human theocracy. Though Elohim was considered the highest potentate, the real high potentates were the priests. They continued to impose their will as vital roles in the community and cultic obligations of religion. The office of the priest gained its highest respect and reputation under the Maccabees because the Maccabees themselves usurped the will of Yahweh, according to Ezekiel 40 through 44, and they became priest, king, generals themselves. All three offices that were meant to be maintained by three different people and of a different family were taken over by one. That began first, I believe, with Jonathan of the family of Hasmoneans, Maccabees, and I believe that he was the youngest of them all. He took on all of those three titles, and he had a bad fate because of that. But both Herod and the Romans severely reduced the importance of the office. The Romans especially taking away even the priestly garments and keeping those under storage, under lock and key, until the priests would actually do their business, when they could come over to the citadel of the Romans and gather up their uniforms and put them on and go over, do their business, and then come back and put them away back in the arms of the Romans, or the guardianship of the Romans. They appointed and deposed priests to suit themselves. In the first century, of course, we see such a number of priests that usually would take it for a lifetime, high priests that is, but one after the other, and sometimes the Romans would let them only serve for less than a year and bring somebody else in, and then somebody else and somebody else. But of those priests that were brought in, never was one of the Zadokite party or the Zadokite blood. There was also a break during this period with earlier Israeli worship. In the First Temple period, it was polytheistic primarily, so we understand now through archaeological finds. Asherah was perhaps worshipped as Yahweh's consort, especially in Israel rather than Judah, remembering the errors of Rehoboam, setting up temples in Dan, and down there in, was it Shechem or Bethel? Bethel, setting up a sacred cow and calling that sacred cow Yahweh, and then setting up a second female goddess with that, the Asherah. in the form of a barren tree. The first to mention a Messiah that would come and set it all straight was the prophets Haggai and Zechariah. Both were prophets of the Persian period, when the time had finally come for Israel and Judah to be free from exile. They saw the Messiah in Zerubbabel of the house of David and Zechariah, who seemed to be able to come to reestablish the ancient royal line. And the first high priest from that period, that was Joshua or Yahshua. Both of them mentioned in Zechariah 2 through 6, and both of them mentioned in Revelation as the two witnesses. If you look to Revelation and the clues that come from the prophecies of Zechariah, and go back to Zechariah and see, you will see who the two witnesses are: Zerubbabel and Yahshua, not Moses and Elijah or Enoch. Not hardly. We've got a king, Zerubbabel, and a priest, Yahshua. In fact, that passage in Haggai, is it? Chapter 2 or 3, whereas Yahshua the priest is before Elohim, and he's commanded, the servants there are commanded to take this dirty toga off of him and put on a clean toga and a clean turban. That's speaking of Yahshua as the high priest of the time of Zechariah, who served under Zerubbabel. But these early hopes didn't come to fruition. Zerubbabel disappeared from history altogether. Now, we don't know what happened to the high priest Yahshua, but they continued to ascend, or high priest descending, I should say, from Yahshua, who was a Zadokite, by the way. And from there, we find general references to a Messiah of David coming from the line of Zadok and David himself. This is still all introduction, so you can see this might take a while, but I'm going to quit in 10 minutes. But this introduction is important. We know so little about the history of the Second Temple period. And there really are not that many sources to learn the history. And this is too fast of an overview to go into any depth, but enough to get to the place where we need to in order to see where this ancient cosmic covenant comes in, especially mine from First Enoch or Ethiopic Enoch. Wisdom, also Chachma in Hebrew, was the learning acquired by study and, listen, formal education. Those who can read and write, those who have engaged in study, and who know literature are the wise par excellence. The literature associated with this tradition is, of course, Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes, but perhaps you're not familiar with Sirach and the Wisdom of Solomon. Of course, those are both books that were written in Greek. They're in the intertestamental period. We find them in the Catholic canon, and it used to be in the Protestant canon, but not in the Jewish canon because they were written in Greek, which was thrown out by the powers that be after the 70 AD destruction of Jerusalem. The wisdom texts from Qumran are almost all non-Essene in origin. I think there are only two texts that are called sapiential literature, that is, wisdom literature. And we think, of course, they developed from this same period, the Persian to the Hasmonean period. These books are Musar le Mevin, if I get that right, Musar le Mevin, also known as 4Q instruction, I'm going to have to X that out. I messed that up a lot. And the Book of Mysteries, which is 1Q27 and 4Q299 through 301. These maybe we should study sometime. There are fragments. But in these two collections of wisdom in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they declare a kind of wisdom or sapiential order of the universe. And though they try to lay it out in mystical terms, they admit that it's a mystery. It's accessible only to specially trained sages. You and me who are a bunch of dummies or simpletons, we can never aspire to the intelligence it would take to understand this wisdom literature. Well, sometimes we'll look at it and see if we can or not. What our goal is here is to try to find this covenant in the Epistle to the Hebrews. Who wrote it? Nobody knows. Yes, there are a lot of guesses. Luke, Barnabas, Epaphroditus, Apollos. But the truth is nobody knows but me. I don't think that New Testament scholars are aware at all of the text 11Q13. It's called the Second Coming of Melchizedek. Hebrews seems to me to be a direct Christian Trinitarian response to 11Q13, the Second Coming of Melchizedek. It's as though Hebrews was answering in detail the questioner in this text, the Second Coming of Melchizedek. I've done some things on that as well, and there's all I've read in commentary about the origin of Hebrews and who wrote it, none of it makes any sense until you understand Hebrews as a response to the Second Coming of Melchizedek. Then all of a sudden, all that the writer of Hebrews writes, all of the writer of Hebrews concocts, is something that addresses the very questions and comments and theology that we find in that Qumran text. So I'm thinking that Hebrews, whoever wrote it, was a convert to Christianity from the Qumran sect. And now, when he speaks to Hebrews, he's not speaking to Christians there. He's not even speaking to Israelites or Jews. He says to the Hebrews. This is what the Qumranites consider themselves, Hebrews. He writes to the Hebrews in response to their understanding in this Second Temple period of a Messiah who they considered to be Enoch or Metatron or the Son of Man, that this Melchizedek had already come in the form, as the letter reads in Greek, of the Lord Jesus Christ. Some have taken the book of Hebrews, that of our general sect, and cast it out. But if it's understood as itself a sectarian document from the sectarian document of Qumran, you've just got to read Second Coming of Melchizedek to understand that. It challenges questions, that is Hebrews, about the issue of cosmic covenant or covenant in general. These are difficult or fully impossible to address from the perspective of covenantal law. We've got the law of Yahweh, the Torah, and we have almost what we have to say an anti-law in Hebrews. In order to make one conform to the other, one has to go to great lengths. And some of the statements in Hebrews makes it impossible. What's certainly needed is a more specific covenant during the Second Temple period that takes into account the broadness of the religion or the denominational religion of Judaism in that first century, including Christianity. We have an idea that everything is homogeneous, that all the Jews follow the Pharisees or Sadducees. But this is not what we get in the primary documents. They talk about 4 main denominations of Judaism, and one is the epitome of Judaism. These primary sources talk about the Essenes as the epitome, and the 4th philosophy, also called innovators. So if there are 4 main brands of Jews, or Hebrews at this time, there are bound to be many, many more offshoots using different types of scriptures, using different kinds of rituals. It's not homogeneous at all. That's why it's become known as intertestamental or Second Temple Judaisms with an S on the end. There's a myriad of them. One of the most difficult of all things to try to compare or contrast is one particular verse in Hebrews, that the new covenant has taken over a covenant that is old, or some translators say obsolete. And here's actually the text of that from Hebrews 8, and we'll quit here just a couple minutes, do the rest of it next time. The sum in Hebrews 8 concerning the things spoken of is, we have a chief priest. Notice, we. The writer of this Hebrews is talking about we who are in our sect, as opposed to you who are in yours. They had a high priest in name only. In the Qumran, he couldn't do any kinds of priestly duties. He didn't slaughter animals. But the writer says, we have a high priest who did sit down at the right hand of the throne of the greatness of the heavens. This comes from Young's Literal. The other translations are far different. Sits down at the right hand of the throne of the greatness in the heavens of the holy places, a servant. Actually, a doulos in Greek, a slave. Look at that. And of the true tabernacle, yours is the false. We have the true, which Yahweh did set up. It's obviously Yahweh didn't set yours up because you don't have any. But Yahweh set ours up, and it couldn't be set up by man because it's in the sky where Yahweh lives. For every chief priest to offer both gifts and sacrifices is appointed, whence it's necessary for this one to have also something that he may offer. For if indeed he were upon earth, he would not be a priest. Continues in a parentheses to try to explain that. There being the priests who are offering according to the law, the gifts, who unto an example and shadow do serve of the heavenly things, as Moses hath been divinely warned, being about to construct the tabernacle. For see, saith he, thou mayest make all things according to the pattern that was shown thee in the mount. Going on. And now he hath obtained a more excellent service, how much also of a better covenant is he mediator. This is a constant comparison here between yours and mine. It's like Pete and I constantly comparing, oh, which on better promises hath been sanctioned. For if that first were faultless, a place would not have been sought for a second. And here's where we find the passage that absolutely breaks things off between the old and the new. For finding fault, he saith to them, Lo, days come, saith Yahweh, and I will compete with the house of Israel and with the house of Yehudah, a new covenant. Not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day of my taking them by their hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, because they did not remain in my covenant, and I did not regard them. It says Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. Because this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, saying, giving my laws into their minds, and upon their hearts I will write them. I will be to them for an Elohim, and they shall be for me a people. And they shall not teach each his neighbor and each his brother, saying, Know thou Yahweh, because they shall all know me, from the small one of them unto the great one of them, because I will be merciful to their unrighteousness, and their sins and their lawlessness I will remember no more. In the saying new, he hath made the first old, and what doth become obsolete, and is old is nigh disappearing. Many translations just chop off the end of that and say obsolete. And it's with this quandary that I want to leave you, since time's up, until next time. And we'll take up, if there's any way to reconcile this, except from the point of view I've just mentioned, that is, in considering 11Q13 as being the text upon which this is a response. In the meantime, maybe you want to take a look at that or listen to my explanation of that at jspresents.org. Now let's look at the chat, see if there's anything on there. Somebody's read Bell and the Dragon. Did you get anything out of that? Yeah. Hi, Pete. Where's Lauren?
Hey, who is it?
Stephanie. Oh, she's our mascot.
That's awesome.
Stephanie eyes to see everyone. Howdy, Pete. Nice
Hi.
to see you.
Nice to see you too. You know, the sins and lawless deeds I will remember no more. It's funny because so many of us look back at our past sins. We have to wonder, when God says that, are we greater than him?
We got to put it away.
Yeah.
We've got to put that stuff away. And I'm afraid that's probably the bane of everybody that believes. They are constantly rubbing their own faces in the manure of the dog.
Well, that was the revelation that changed my life. Was Jeremiah 31:34.
Yeah.
You just reading?
Mm-hmm.
And then
No, it was re-quoted in Hebrews.
Yeah, and I read that today. That's changed my life. Because I thought, why am I always remembering these things? Am I greater than God who's forgotten?
Here's Pete.
That's a good word, isn't it, Jack?
Go ahead.
Well, it was really interesting because I was always under condemnation. And we read also that there's no condemnation for those that are in Christ Jesus. But I was. And finally, one day I got a revelation. It came from Jeremiah 31:34 in that cross-reference in Hebrews. And I was in Anning, China, which means place of peace. And I stopped and I saw all these young people there. I was taking in a group, having so much fun. And I thought, why can't I have any fun? Why am I always stirred up and under condemnation? And I saw it in the cloud. It was a triangular cloud with the sun behind it. It was as if that scripture just burst forth. Your sins and iniquities I will remember no more. And then it was like the Lord spoke to my heart and said, if I don't remember them, who are you to remember them constantly? Are you greater than me? And from that time forth, and that was actually about 10 years ago, November 2008, 10 years ago, I've never had that problem again because it became a revelation to me. Good word, Jackson.
Amen.
I'm
Thank you,
glad I
brother.
could come down and be part of that.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
May Yahweh bless you and your ministry.
Thank you.
He's got a big ministry.
Good word.
That kid right there that I helped raise.
Yeah.
I asked my mother, please send him back. He cries too much. But I thank you for coming, and we'll continue this next week. Good to see all of you. Good to see you, Ellis. Missing you guys, Joshua. And we'll pick this up if we're anyplace Tuesday that we have internet. We don't know where we're going to be. Maybe Maverick Chaparral's. That's where we're headed to. You know Maverick Chaparral? Anybody? All right. He's the big antagonist on the think tank. Yeah.
I know Maverick.
We're going to go see him. Yeah. We're going to break the mystery of Maverick Chaparral. I'm going to actually take pictures of him and of his wife and his ex-wife who lives downstairs. But don't tell anybody, all right? Love you guys. We're having a good time. Send money. We're about out here. We don't know whether we're going to home or not.